When a person first starts playing chess, they have serious trouble hanging onto their stuff. They give pawns and pieces away, one after the other. And when they lose, it can be both frustrating and embarrassing. As time goes by and they get a bit of experience, they do a better job holding on to their army. But piece giveaways still occur when they least expect it. So, you're not alone. This is something everyone experiences. To cure this disease, you need to train yourself to always make sure your pieces are protected. Once you become very aware of piece safety, you need to learn basic tactics, then strategy. At the same time, train your mind to avoid the psychological pitfalls I discussed in Lecture 22. And if you do all of that, and have also learned the end games in our past lectures, and put together a basic opening repertoire, you might well find that you are more formidable than you ever thought you would be. Of course, in chess, there's always room, lots and lots of room, for improvement. That includes amateurs and professionals alike. But for amateurs, it's very important to see exactly how other amateurs think and what kinds of errors they, and most likely you, make. By doing so, you can improve in those areas before they become a problem. So, let's share a trip into the amateur's mind. You're going to make opening mistakes for the rest of your life. Even world champions make opening mistakes, so it's unavoidable. However, there are small opening mistakes and Armageddon-level opening mistakes. Fortunately, there are some simple guidelines that can cut down on the end-of-the-world opening scenario. Here's how you create a low-risk opening repertoire. Most amateurs want to emulate the world champions, but you need to rein in that fantasy and start with small steps, just like the champions did. Start out with an easy-to-understand opening repertoire that doesn't demand too much memorization. There's nothing worse than losing to someone who has memorized everything, but that will happen if you choose professional-level systems, which often take you on a razor's edge path. If you think your tactics are subpar, don't play openings that live and die on tactics. Follow basic opening precepts. If you make sure you control part of the center, and if you develop your whole army and castle quickly, you'll do just fine. When you start out, it's best to play opponents who are at your level or one class higher. Play someone at your level will feed your ego a bit, while playing someone a class higher won't feed your ego, but it will teach you a lot. Mixing the two is a good formula to follow. Our first example of two amateurs going head-to-head features pretty strong players. They are both in the A class, which is a couple classes better than the average tournament player, which is in the C class. In fact, the A class is the highest rating class before you enter the world of experts and masters. D4, D5, knight to D2. This isn't a particularly good move, since the knight isn't on an aggressive square, and it also blocks the C1 bishop. But it's fully playable, and it fits into White's opening repertoire. If someone plays this move against me, I immediately understand what he wants to do. In fact, I always want to get inside the head of all my opponents. He's avoiding mainline theory, which is a wise choice, and preparing to create a setup which he's obviously well acquainted with. The setup he wants is a reverse Dutch, and I've seen countless amateurs embrace this opening. So I'd be pretty sure that he'd be continuing with E3, C3, F4, and he'd bring his knight out to F3 and then move on to E5 at some point. All these things are going to be second nature to him. Here's the position he's dreaming of. White's dream position isn't bad at all, and it's incredibly easy to learn. So, I would already know exactly what he wants, and since he would be stronger if he reached his dream position, I would immediately go out of my way to deprive him of his beloved setup. Always take your opponent out of his comfort zone. Let's see how the actual game went. D4, D5, knight D2. Knight C6, trying to take advantage of what white has done. Now I develop a piece and I hit D4, so he has to do something about that. E3, a move that he wanted to play anyway. However, now I have a choice. Bishop F5, this was played in the actual game, it's okay. But personally, I would make use of this and go E5. Because I'm playing E5, it destroys the guy's dream position. He can no longer play it. And suddenly I'd be in charge, he'd be upset, and advantage black. But black's choice wasn't so bad. White, continuing to play his dream position, plays C3. And after E6, and once again, pushing that pawn all the way would be my choice, F4, white got the setup he wanted, he's happy, and yet black was also happy. As you can see, both sides treated the opening in a simple but acceptable manner. White wisely strived to get a position that he was familiar with, and black, who wasn't conversant with white's setup, made solid, logical, developing moves. He certainly didn't punish his opponent in the opening, but he did get out of the opening with a perfectly reasonable position. This philosophy allowed both players to avoid an opening memorization apocalypse, and they were able to enter the middle game on equal footing. Overlooking the opponent's reply is extremely common in amateur chess. Player 1 makes a move. Player 2 replies with something that should be obvious, and player 1 retreats, thereby losing 2 moves. The cure is simple. If you think your move looks good, make sure you know what your opponent's plan is too, and ask, what is my opponent's best reply? Notice the best before reply. When looking to see what your opponent will do, always try hard to find out what you deem best for your adversary. In this position, black acted as if he didn't have an opponent by playing Queen B4. He was thinking, this ties white's queen down to the defense of the B3 knight, and it also puts pressure against D4. Okay, that's all well and good, but what is white going to do? Fall on the floor and grovel? It's so important to realize that you have an opponent and that your opponent wants to thrash you. The only way you're going to avoid that thrashing is to play both sides of the board, which will enable you to be ready for every eventuality. Black had quite a few interesting choices. He could have played F6, attacking the center. We also had a possibility of knight D B8, retreating the knight, but what that does is allows him to perhaps play B6, and the bishop can then come out and trade off. That's a very advanced idea, but the simple F6 would have been excellent. Instead, though, we're back to Queen B4. So black had all these wonderful thoughts with it, but he didn't look at anything white was going to do. And so after Queen B4, white played Knight D3, which immediately tells black that his move was a serious mistake, since the queen has no choice but to run back in desperation. And after Queen E7, he's wasted 2 full moves. He started here, white made a move, it's like he did nothing, and white makes another move. After black played the humiliating Queen E7, I would have continued bishop takes C6, B takes C6, knight D C5, knight C5, and knight C5. And we end up in a position where this knight is a monster. It can never be gotten rid of. Black's bishop is awful, and white has an enormous advantage. Let's stop and ponder something. If you were black, and you were looking at the move Queen B4, is it too difficult to see white's reply, Knight D3 attacking your queen? Not at all. The only reason a player would miss that is bad habits. He just didn't bother to look. Here's another example. d4, d5. White plays a gambit known as the Black-Mardemer gambit. He's offering a pawn for rapid development. Black, not wanting to walk into White's prepared stuff, plays his knight to f6. e5, the knight retreats. And here, the rather odd bishop to b5. This is a move that completely discounts any enemy reply. White's living in his own world. He sees a pin, and that's that. But pushing aside the fact that the pin can be ended right away by c6 or kicked around by a6, one has to ask a couple questions. Placing the bishop on d3 leaves that piece controlling two nice diagonals. Why limit this bishop by banishing it to b5? And if White had no intention of taking the d7 knight, which isn't doing much and wasn't going to move anytime soon, then why move it to b5 in the first place? As you can see, there's no logic behind White's move, and I'm sure he wouldn't be able to answer any of these questions. Black decided to just let it sit there, lonely and forgotten, and replied with e6 with a good position. Here's another example of a player completely ignoring his opponent's reply. White has a pleasant position. His first order of business should be castling, which gets the king to safety and brings the h1 rook into the game. After that, with a safe king, a central space advantage thanks to White's pawn center, and a lead in development, White will have many nice, safe options to choose from. Instead, he played something I consider to be almost incomprehensible. Bishop to g5. BB, who was White, said, "Although this piece has moved twice in the opening, I could not resist this pin. The d4 pawn was over-defended anyway." His reasoning is badly flawed. But whatever his reasoning was, castling should always be the #1 priority unless you have another move that needs to be played right away. Bishop g5 isn't that move. The fact is that Black wanted to play bishop e7 anyway, so he could castle and finish his development. It's hardly surprising that after bishop g5, Black replied, bishop e7. So much for the pin. The pin existed for a nanosecond. Then, after Black played the most obvious move on the board, the pin was gone. Black could also have played h6, which would have attacked the bishop and made it run. Anyway, after the further moves, castles, rook ac1, d6, rook fd1, knight g3, h6, White realized that he didn't want to give his bishop away for that knight. And he also understood that bishop h4 loses to g5. So, what did he do? He moved the bishop again to f4. When it becomes clear that his imaginary pin with bishop g5 did nothing but waste time. Let's take a look at White's correct move, castles. Bishop e7, the move that Black wanted to play. And now d5, gaining space, threatening d6, winning the piece in many positions. Even a solid move, if you didn't want to do this, for example, f3, guarding everything, is preferable. But I really like this d5 move. And you can see that White is making something happen. He's gaining space. He's dominating the board. Instead of the other move, bishop g5, which was basically just a one-move thought of a pin, and everything else went sour afterwards. So, a pin is a pin if it stays a pin. If he plays the move he wanted to do anyway and your pin is gone, what's the point? If you always look for your opponent's response to whatever you play and just miss his reply from time to time, then that's fine. Everyone misses a move here and there. But many amateurs don't look for the other side's moves. They just look for their own. In effect, this is playing in a vacuum, which won't end well for you. So it's critical to create a habit that compels you to play both sides of the board. Before you make a move, know your opponent's reply. A simpler way to put it is, forewarned is forearmed. It's an oldie but goodie, and it works very well for chess. When beginners hang pieces and more experienced amateurs fear the slightest threats, it's hardly surprising that fighting for a lone square isn't high on their checklist. However, awareness of squares is something that needs to be nurtured, since it will pay huge dividends. In general, your opponents won't be aware that they are giving away a square. And since it's a visual thing, it's certainly something you should train yourself to look for. White just moved his bishop back and challenged Black's bishop on f5. Black, who didn't want his pawns to be doubled if White takes on f5, traded on c2, and after queen takes c2, actually helped White by developing his queen on a good square. That's perfectly okay. However, what about squares? The move Black wanted to play before White moved his bishop back was castle. That's what he wanted to do, get his king safe, castle. But then all of a sudden he thought he was being threatened by this bishop. But why can't he just castle and do what he wanted to do? If the bishop was captured, you'd take back. Is this a disaster? Well, not at all. Is the pawn at f5 weak? No, at any moment you can guard it by playing g6, and it's as solid as a rock. Okay, well, what else? Well, you've just opened the e-file for your rook and hit this pawn way down here. Well, that's a good thing too that you didn't have before. And you have total control over e4. That's not bad either. And finally, you really have a choice. You can bow to the opponent and just do what he wants and take the thing, take the bishop and allow him to develop his piece, or you can actually just do what you want. And when he takes something, you find that you have a whole plethora of different interesting advantages that never existed before. This is a continuation of the previous game, several moves later. In this game, Black played the passive knight d7, hoping to exchange some pieces. It's playable, but I don't really see how it's helpful. On the other hand, what about the f5 square? The knight on f5 is very well placed. It keeps White's f3 knight from moving to h4, and it pressures the d4 pawn, which will eventually get hit when Black pushes his c-pawn and puts pressure on it. More importantly is the block against the f4 pawn, which can't move forward as long as the knight sits on the majestic f5 perch. And if that pawn can't move, White's bishop will remain blocked by its own pawn. The best move was h5, preventing g4 and thus laying claim to f5. After cementing his knight into f5, Black will then follow up with c5 with a fantastic position. Hunting down squares might seem subtle, but spotting them doesn't need a deep understanding of positional play. Instead, it's visual. If you see a hole, also known as a support point, claim it. And as in the position we just looked at, if the opponent can fight for that square, you can use a pawn to stop the fight once and for all. The move h5 created what's known as an artificial support point. Which minor piece should you try hardest to keep? Bishops and knights offer levels upon levels, with beginners having no idea what all the hoopla is about. Reasonably experienced players coveting one minor piece over another, as if a position's truth is based on taste, And experts, just below master and dying to get there, thinking they have figured out the secrets of the bishop and knight, only to see that the knight they put so much faith in gets dominated by the enemy bishop. I'm all for picking a favorite, and I have always had a deep love for knights. But though it's my favorite minor piece, if one is better than the other, I'm going to toss love out the window and embrace whichever one is going to help me win the game. When it comes to choosing which minor piece you're going to retain during a game, you need to look at the landscape without emotion and make the decision purely on the position's needs. This can be difficult for anyone, masters included. So imagine how often far lower rated players make the wrong decision. Fortunately, though, you will make the wrong choice on many occasions. That mistake will help you in future games. Ultimately, repeated minor malfunctions will make you a far stronger player. Black got a fantastic opening, and now white is behind in development and his king's in the center. Black has to decide on one of two captures. Either bishop takes the knight or knight takes the knight. The real question is, which one of those two minor pieces are more important in this position? Press pause and give it a little thought. In the game, black played knight takes f3 check. And after g takes f3, bishop f5, knight e4, what do you think of this bishop on f5? Does that look really imposing? No. So let's go back. The other choice was bishop takes. And after pawn takes, what do you think of black's knight? That's a powerful piece. So sometimes you don't have to go too crazy and calculate or anything like that. You can just say, okay, I'm going to get rid of one piece. But when I do so, which piece is going to be better? And in this case, clearly this powerful knight, which controls squares all over the board, is the clear choice. Our next topic is hiding behind the safety of giving check, a very common disease. There's something about a check that makes people feel safe and free and powerful. The opponent's king's in check. He has to find a way out of it. What could be better? Fortunately, life isn't so simple. Just like any other move, a check needs to have a particular, hopefully positive, purpose. Checking for the joy of the check can force your opponent to improve his position or make a move he intended to do anyway, or move the checking piece to a poor square, or simply prove to be a complete waste of time. Black's behind in development, so something like knight f6 or bishop d6, any of these moves make a lot of sense, just developing. However, black had a different idea. Bishop b4 check. Apparently, the idea of checking somebody was so powerful that he couldn't resist. After c3, the check's gone. The bishop's attacked, and he just has to move backwards. White gets to play the move that he really wanted to play anyway, and black has to run away, waste time. Not a good idea. Don't check for check's sake. This position's from a well-known gambit line that leaves black with a big lead in development. White didn't help himself with his next move, which fails to bring out a piece. d5. The mentality of, I'm attacking him so I'm safe, is so similar to, I'm checking his king so I have to be safe. Both are fallacies. Now black should play knight b4, threatening knight c2 check, knight a3, bishop c5, bishop e2, rook e8. And it's hard for white to find a useful move. This position is absolutely awful for white. However, the lure of attacking him proved to be too much for white. Here's an old saying, always check, it might be mate. Really? This is perhaps the most ludicrous saying in all of chess. no doubt created by someone who just learned how to move the pieces. If you follow that advice, you will lose and lose and lose. It's the black hole of chess sayings. However, let's change it to something more reasonable. Always look at all possible checks. Your opponent checking you and you checking him to see which is the most useful in some other manner. So, black couldn't resist, check. Knight c3, rook e8, check. He must have been very excited to get another check. Bishop e2. Now he moves his knight because it was threatened by the pawn, and white moves to the side. Now, black still has a good game, but it would have been so much better the other way. It's always been my way to introduce players of all ratings to fairly advanced concepts. You may not fully grasp these things, but once you're introduced to them, and once you've seen examples which illustrate their importance, these concepts stick with you and over time make more and more sense. The immediate lesson here is don't check unless it improves your position in some way. And don't fear a check unless you can prove to yourself that it's a real problem.